Mr. Gabrielson has studied at the University of Hawaii, and he paid particular attention during those studies to minority issues in Japanese culture. So that makes him well prepared, and he has given similar lectures to this one in Hawaii. So let's welcome Mr. Gabrielson.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me if I don't use the microphone, or should I use the microphone? What do you think? You're okay? Okay. I will try it without the microphone now. So my name is Carl Gabrielson. My topic tonight is Hanryu, the Korean wave in Japan. So perhaps you have noticed that in recent years, there's a lot more Korean pop music on TV and on the radio than there used to be. There's a lot more Korean dramas on TV. And this was a very sudden change. And because Korea and Japan have a very unique relationship, this change has had some very interesting results. So today I'm going to start by introducing what the Korean wave is. I'm going to talk about how it came to Japan and what effects it has had on Japan and on Japan's relationship with Korea. Okay. If you have questions, please save them for the end, and at the end we'll save some time to have a little question and answer session. Okay? Okay, so first, the Korean wave, or Hanryu, sometimes Kanryu in Japanese, Hallyu in Korean. I don't really speak Korean, that's why I researched Japan, so I hope my Korean is okay. I checked, and Wikipedia says this is correct. But the Korean wave is the spread of South Korean pop culture. It can be TV. For example, I don't know if anyone knows the Korean version of Boys Over Flowers. It's very popular even in Hawaii, actually, but very popular in several countries outside of Korea, based on, of course, the Japanese manga and the Japanese and Taiwanese dramas. We also have movies, such as Old Boy, again, also based on a Japanese manga. And music, so you know who this is? Girls' Generation, or Shoujo Jidai, right? So this is something that's been happening since about 1999. And in 1999, it was actually a journalist in China who pointed out there's all of this media coming in from Korea, and they started calling it the Korean wave. So from there, the word Korean wave spread to Korea, which started referring to the phenomenon as the Korean wave. And it spread to other countries too. Now you can find evidence of the Korean wave even in the Middle East, in Latin America, in parts of Europe. Not as much in America, except in Hawaii. In Hawaii, you can go to just about any drugstore and find Korean DVDs, which was something that really surprised me. I'm right. Okay, thank you. So, this is something that started just with Korea creating dramas and China and other places picking them up, but it became very successful very quickly, and it became something that the Korean government started promoting as a way to create soft power. Soft power means getting other countries, other cultures to like you by presenting positive images of yourself. That the idea is, if everyone likes you, if you're popular, people will respect you and people will listen to your opinions. So this is a political theory called soft power. And the Korean government is trying to increase their soft power by using this Korean wave. Okay, so the Korean wave, like I said, started in 1999, but it didn't actually come to Japan until much later. And the reason for that is that Korea and Japan have a fairly complex relationship. So I want to go through that quickly, just give you some of the key points in that relationship. So first, as many of you probably know, Korea was a colony of Japan from 1910 to 1945. Now during that time period, there were some very strict eras and some more relaxed eras, but in general, Japanese policy was not particularly kind to Korea. They did carry out a lot of economic development in Korea, but they also repressed a lot of Koreans' rights and the Korean language. So this is a period that most Koreans are not happy about, and that even today, you will find attitudes in Korea of negativity about this time period. In fact, does anyone know what Prime Minister Noda did yesterday? Nobody watches the news. That's okay. So yesterday, Prime Minister Noda was in Korea returning important Korean historical books that were taken by the Japanese government during this time. So this is something that causes issues even today. Now during this time was the first real Korean boom. There was a big boom in the popularity of Korean music, Korean art, and images of Korea by Japanese artists. And the reason for this was that Japan became a modern country just 50 years before this, right? So a lot of people could still remember what it was like before Japan was modern. And the change from being, the Edo period and samurai to suddenly having trains and factories and, big cities and jobs was a big shock for a lot of people. So a lot of people looked back on the past and kind of wished for that simpler time. And they started seeing Korea as like Japan's past. If we went to Korea, we could time travel back. Now this isn't really an accurate or fair way to think of Korea, right? If I went to Korea now and felt like I was time traveling back, that would be kind of looking down on Korea, right? Saying, oh, they're not as advanced as I am. So this wasn't a very respectful way, but it was still a positive feeling that caused Japanese people at the time to become much more interested in Korean art and Korean music. Okay, so moving forward in time, in the 1980s and 90s, Korea was a very popular tourist destination for Japanese businessmen who wanted to get away from their families and wives and party and engage in all kinds of bad behavior. So again, this is not a very positive image of Korea that you have in Japan. It's where salarymen go to play, right? It's like a whole country of kabukicho, right? So again, not a very positive image. During this whole time period, up until 1998, Korea completely banned any import of Japanese media. So no TV, no movies, no anime, no manga, nothing from Japan was allowed into Korea. And this was largely because of the negative feelings connected to the colonial period. They said, we don't want you influencing our culture. We had a time in the past when you influenced our culture, and it hurt us, so we don't want it. So they created a ban. Finally, in 1998, they partially lifted the ban. They said, great works of Japanese art, really excellent cinema and really high-quality media can come into Korea. And for 4 years, that was all that could come. But 2002 was declared the Korea-Japan Friendship Year. Does anyone know what happened in 2002? World Cup, right? The World Cup was jointly hosted by Japan and Korea. That was a part of this. And when the two countries agreed to host the World Cup together, Korea finally said, okay, as part of building this new friendship, we will completely open our doors to Japanese media. So in 2002 was the first time that any Japanese movie, any Japanese comic, any Japanese TV show could come into Korea. And in order to be fair, Japan said, okay, we'll accept Korean media too. So at this time, you started seeing a few Korean dramas, usually on cable TV. And then, one very special Korean drama was put on cable TV, on NHK's, what is it, BS, right? Anyone know what that drama would be? Winter Sonata. Winter Sonata was made in Korea in 2002. It came to Japan in 2003, and it became the most popular show ever to be on Japanese television. It started out on BS, so you could only watch it with cable. They showed it on BS twice, which is very rare for any drama, but it was very popular the first time. They showed it again. It was so popular after the second time, they moved it to regular NHK. And it was so popular the third time, and so many fans were asking for it, that they showed it a fourth time, again on NHK. So it showed 4 times. By the fourth time, the fans loved it so much, they said, we don't want to see our favorite actors with Japanese voices. We want the original voices. So this is the first time that a foreign TV show that had Japanese dubbing, a Japanese soundtrack, used subtitles and the original sounds. Before this, if they made a Japanese soundtrack, they used the Japanese soundtrack. So this was a really big change already, just from this one show. In 2004, this show earned $2.4 billion. Not yen, dollars. $2.4 billion. Most of that money came from Japan. The show had some fans in Korea. It wasn't a big hit, but it did okay. Had a couple of fans in other countries. But really, it was a huge, huge hit in Japan. In fact, in 2009, it was remade as animation. And this was another big event, that actually, this was the first time Korea and Japan ever worked together to create a cartoon. So you had Japanese animation studios providing the animation, and the original actors from the TV show adding the voices to create a complete animated remake of the show. This was even in 2009, that's just 2 years ago. So the show is a big deal. And one of the really interesting things about this show is who was watching. Because who was watching? Who do you think most of the audience were for this show? Sorry? Old ladies. Middle-aged and older women. This is old ladies. Old ladies loved this show. So, why? What was the appeal? Why did everyone think this show was so great? There's two main theories. Actually, this is such a big deal. A lot of scholars have looked at this, and they've come up with two big theories for how it developed. The first is nostalgia, longing for the past, right? Wishing to get back to the past. This is very similar to the reason why there was a Korea boom during the colonial period, from 1910 to 1945, right? You had older Japanese people wishing for something from their past and getting what they wanted through this show. So what were they getting? They were getting two things. One, the style of this show, the emotions, the themes, the images, were very similar to Japanese TV of the 70s and 80s. They weren't like the Japanese TV produced in 2002. Japanese TV produced in 2002 was mainly targeting young people, junior high school, college students. It wasn't targeting old ladies, and old ladies weren't interested. But this show came along, and it had something they could relate to. This is like what they used to watch when they were young. The other part is that it really focused on traditional values, right? When someone wants to get married, they ask their parents for permission, right? When a man and a woman fall in love, they don't even kiss. They don't even hold hands. They barely touch. Maybe they hug when they say hello, right? It's getting back to the values of an older time, when maybe people thought society was a little better than it is now. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why it's popular. The other reason why it's popular was the main actor, Bae Young-jun, also known as Yon-sama. Yon-sama. A lot of the women loved Yon-sama. They thought he was the perfect man. Why did they like him so much? He's a sensitive, romantic guy. He could cook. He could clean up after himself. And if it came down to a choice between his job and the woman that he loved, he always chose the woman he loved. Right? This character captured the hearts of all of these women. They looked at this and they said, that is the man that I was supposed to marry. Also, in this show, he's not shown as being aggressive or sexy. He's shown as being very polite, a gentleman. He's always wearing a lot of clothes, a big heavy coat and a scarf and a sweater. So it's really all about his personality and his attitude. It's not so much about his looks. And so you can look at this and you can say, why did all of these women want a man who cleans up after himself and who can cook and who thinks that his wife is more important than his job. A lot of fans have said Yon-sama is much better than their real husbands. They said, I don't want this guy, I want Yon-sama, right? I don't want the man who comes home and ignores me until it's time for dinner. I want the man who's waiting at home with dinner ready and wants to talk to me about my day. Okay, so what happened was you get this crazy love of this actor. And it starts being called, especially by negative media, by people who are not happy about all the women loving this, and they call it Yonfluenza, right? The Yon-sama disease. So let's look at Yonfluenza. He first came to Japan in 2004. When he arrived, there were between 5,000 and 7,000 fans, about 95% older women, waiting at the airport and screaming to see him. Now, for comparison, let's look at when Brad Pitt came to Japan for the first time, or when Beckham came to Japan for the first time. 500 for Beckham, 1,000 for Brad Pitt, and 5,000 to 7,000 for Yon-sama. That's a crazy difference. People loved him, right? He came again in 2009. One of his first scheduled visits was to meet the wife of Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama. He got off the plane and he went to meet the Prime Minister's wife. And then he went to a stadium full of old women to talk about his new book.
Bad.
Since that time, he's huge in Japanese advertising, right? He has glasses, teas, bentos, energy drinks, pizza delivery, cameras, Seicom security. And I don't know if anyone has looked across the street recently, but when you're walking outside, if you look across the street, you'll see this. Our Family Mart right out there has Yon-sama Love Hanryu campaign right there. In fact, every Family Mart has this poster somewhere outside or inside right now. Every Family Mart I've seen in Tokyo. So even today, he's still being used. It shows how strong his fan base really is. So let's talk about his fans a little bit. Who are these women who love him and who keep showing up when he arrives at the airport and who keep buying his books and buying products that he advertises? One of the biggest things that Hanryu changed is this group of old ladies. Before Hanryu, if you wanted to make products for old ladies, you made women's magazines, you made things that are useful in the kitchen, you made, I don't know, underwear that makes you look skinny, right? You made old lady products. You didn't really make media products, right? You didn't have a lot of old ladies going out and buying CDs and DVDs and posters. But now that's changed, right? Because of Winter Sonata, suddenly you had all of these old ladies going out and buying all of this stuff that's not for their family, it's not stuff they really need, and it's not stuff that they really bought in the past. So this is a really big change for how people shop. And it also becomes a big change for companies, because suddenly you have this whole new group of shoppers. You say, okay, we have new shoppers, so we have to market to them, we have to get them to buy our products. So in the beginning, of course, you have the show goods, right? That's normal. You have the show DVDs, posters. If anyone's watched Winter Sonata, there's a very famous necklace scene. So of course you can buy the necklace from Winter Sonata. You can buy scripts, you can buy photo books from the show. And all this wasn't so new. There were other women's fan groups that liked different kinds of media, and they would go and buy goods like this. Then you have the fan goods. You have biographies of the stars. You have maybe a pillow with a big Yon-sama face on it, or a Winter Sonata mug. You have Winter Sonata Pachinko, Part 1 and Part 2. Does everyone know Pachinko, right? Gambling. That was a real new one. Pachinko wasn't marketed towards older women very much before this. And suddenly you have Winter Sonata Pachinko, and you have more old women getting interested in Pachinko. Apart from that, all of these things, biographies, pillows, mugs, they existed for other kinds of old lady fans. I don't know if anyone knows the Takarazuka Review, or certain Johnny's bands had some older lady fans who might buy these goods. But with Winter Sonata, the scale was much larger. You had more women buying more stuff and spending more money. But then the really big change was not in the show goods or the fan goods. It was in what's called the peripheral goods. These women who had never bought a DVD in their lives suddenly wanted to buy DVD players. And then they realized that they're not the only one who's a fan. So they would want to join a community, or they would want to get more information about their stars. So they would buy computers. They would set up internet connections in their home. They would get printers so they could print out scripts and translations. They would watch the show and they would look at the foods and they'd say, oh, that looks good. And they'd start going to Korean restaurants or buying Korean cookbooks. And then women started even taking Korean language classes. Suddenly there was a huge boom in studying Korean language, especially for older women. And it's all because of this show. Suddenly you have women who before, they liked to watch TV. Maybe they had a couple of hobbies or groups of friends, and sometimes, they would do the housework. And now suddenly they have this whole new world of interests. They're using the internet. They're looking at computers. They're learning to cook Korean foods. They're learning a new language. So all this was a really big change. And it led to another big form of consuming Hanryu, which is Hanryu tourism. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, up until the 1990s, Korea was mainly a tourist destination for businessmen who wanted to get away from their families and party, right? It wasn't a place that women went on vacation. The image was, it's kind of cheap, it's kind of dirty, it's kind of dangerous, we don't really want to go there. That was the image. I'm not saying that's how Korea was, but that was the image. But suddenly, you watch this drama of these beautiful, romantic young people falling in love and going to trendy cafes in the heart of Seoul. And it doesn't look dangerous, it doesn't look dirty, it looks like a nice place. So you suddenly have this complete change in the image of Korea. And that leads to a huge boost in Korea tourism. If you look at March, make sure I get the years right, March of 2003, before Winter Sonata was put on TV, and March of 2004, after Winter Sonata was put on TV, you have a 250% increase in tourism going to Korea. And that's mostly older women. So suddenly you have more and more women going to Korea because they feel like it's safe, it's modern, it's interesting. Also because they want to see the places where this drama was made, right? They've become serious fans, and they want to go and see the hotels and the ski slopes and the houses and the cafes where this was filmed. So you have all these drama tours, women going in whole big busloads and package tours put together by Japanese companies to travel around Korea and see all of the places that were used to make Winter Sonata. So suddenly Korea becomes a huge tourist destination for Japanese women. And so you have cases like this, where you have suddenly on the streets of Seoul, you have women wearing an apron that says, I can give you tourist information in Japanese. So that Japanese women can feel it's even safer, even more convenient to travel to Korea. So we have a huge shift from men going to Korea to party to women going to Korea because they want to relax, they want to enjoy it. And in many cases, they want to get away from their husbands. Like I said, Yon-sama was a fantasy of, he's so much better than my husband. This is the man I really want. So Korea was a way to escape from the so-so husband and enjoy this wonderful country connected to all of these fantasies you have of romance and youth and family values. And because you have so many women going, Korea responded by developing beauty tourism. Right? What are the most famous products that you buy if you go to Korea? Cosmetics. Cosmetics. Or people go to Korea to go to spas, to have akasiri massage, right? That's all marketed to women. And that didn't exist before Winter Sonata. It was there in Korea, but it wasn't a part of why women traveled there. So this is a change even in Korea, how they changed their tourist industry to encourage more Japanese women to come. You also have Koreatown tourism inside Japan. The best example of that is just over here, where? Shin-Okubo. Shin-Okubo, right? Shin-Okubo used to be a center for the Korean community in Tokyo, right? It used to be the place where Koreans would go to buy Korean groceries and buy Korean goods, maybe buy Korean music. Now it's a place where Japanese people go to buy Korean goods and Korean groceries and Korean music. If you talk to the shop owners at the most popular shops, they'll indicate that the vast majority of their clients, their customers, are Japanese people who want to come and buy Korean goods. Before Winter Sonata, Shin-Okubo was an area that you didn't go to, had a bad reputation. But now everybody goes there because you know it's the best place to get good Korean food. It's the best place to get the newest Korean CDs. So, what are some of the effects that these changes have had on Japanese society? Of course, the biggest one is suddenly there's a much more positive image of Korea. That if you look at polls taken of Japanese people, especially young people, after Hanryu really became popular, you see that the number of people who say they have a positive image of Korea goes up considerably. More and more people like Korea, want to visit Korea, have a positive image of Korea. You also have the sense of both Hanryu stars and Hanryu fans acting as cultural bridges. Right? You have these fans who are suddenly more interested in learning about Korean culture, and who are also interested in going to Korea, meeting Korean people, making friends, using language skills, eating foods. So you have all of this new cultural exchange. On the other side, you have the stars who are coming over to Japan and promoting Korea, right? When Yon-sama came in 2009, he was promoting a photo book that he took. There's all his photos of beautiful places in Korea. And he brought that over to show Japanese people beautiful places they might like to visit, encouraging more people to go between Japan and Korea. So you have a sense of more interaction between the two, and also more positive interaction, building cultural bridges. Also, you have more people going into the Korean towns, more people being interested in Korean food and media, which draws more attention to Koreans already living in Japan, the Zainichi Korean minority. So, after Winter Sonata, I think it was December of 2004, there was a big popular TV drama called Tokyo Wanke, Tokyo Bayview. It was all about a Zainichi Korean woman, played by Nakama Yukie, right, one of the most beautiful actresses in Japan. She played a Zainichi Korean woman who was successful and rich and had her own business and fell in love with a Japanese man. Okay? So suddenly you have this really positive image of a Zainichi Korean. If you look before that show, the Zainichi Korean characters were usually poor. It was often a story about the past, 20, 30, 50 years ago instead of right now. But it shows that this image of clean, beautiful, young, modern Koreans even applied to the Koreans living in Japan. However, on top of all these positive effects, there was a fairly negative effect in the form of a right-wing backlash. You had a lot of people saying, why are we spending so much time talking about Korea and thinking about Korea? We need to focus on Japan. Our country is Japan. We should be proud of Japan. We shouldn't be letting all of our women fall in love with Korean men. Right? We shouldn't be watching only Korean shows. What about Japan? So in some cases, this was just patriotism. It was just people saying, Korea's nice, but I prefer Japan. But in other cases, it became much more extreme. And the most extreme case, perhaps you've heard of it, was a manga called Manga Kenkanyu. Kenkanyu means hate. It can mean hating the Korean wave or the wave of hating Korea. You can read it either way. So it's a little unclear. But it was a series of 4 manga. The first one was published in 2005. And it uses the story of a couple of Japanese university students who are interested in studying Asian history. It uses them to look at the issues, the disputed issues between Japan and Korea, such as the Takeshima or Dokdo Island issue, the issues of comfort women and other things related to war history. It uses these university student characters to look at those issues and to say, oh, Japan is right. Oh, Korea is lying. Korea is trying to control Japan. These mangas were extremely successful. And in fact, even yesterday, Kenkanyu 1 and Kenkanyu 2 occupied the #1 spot and the #2 spot on Amazon.jp's International Affairs section. Not even the manga section, but the International Affairs section. So it shows that they are extremely popular. They sold very well. They talk about Hanryu as being a plan to manipulate the Japanese people, to make Japanese people like Korea, so that they will forget about all of these issues, Takeshima and Dokdo, so that Korea will get the upper hand when it does business with Japan. And as they attack Hanryu, they also attack the women who like them. They say, this Winter Sonata is a stupid drama, and you women who watch it are being manipulated, you're being controlled. They're trying to force you to fall in love with Korean men so that you will forget your own country. It was seen almost as this big crisis. Oh, we're going to lose all of our women to Korea because the women are foolish and Korean media is controlling them. It's a very shocking manga. I don't know if anyone's read it. I've read it. It's quite shocking. And in fact, it has been very heavily criticized in Japan and in foreign countries. People have pointed out that a lot of the history in it is not very accurate. But for me, what I found most shocking was that you have images of Japanese people that look like this. They look like the typical Japanese person you see in any manga or in any Japanese cartoon. But when you see a Korean person or a Zainichi Korean person in this manga, they look like almost like an ugly caricature, an extreme version of an Asian person. They have the extremely slanty eyes and big cheekbones. They look like the art that America used to make about Japan when America and Japan were at war. It's an extremely shocking difference, despite the fact that most Zainichi Koreans look Japanese, that if you see them, you probably couldn't guess they were Korean. So it really shows that this comic is using visual images to really highlight racial differences, ethnic differences. And that's another reason why it's very heavily criticized. But I will say that it has had, despite all of this negativity, and despite this comic book being extremely popular, it has not had such an extremely strong effect on Japan and on Hanryu today. The Hanryu still exists, right? I showed you the picture of Family Mart right now. So I want to talk a little bit about how Hanryu continues today. So, of course, we have K-pop. So you know who this is? 21. I'm a little bit of a fan. 21. So if I could probably show you several other pictures and you'd say, oh, that's Kara, oh, that's Tobo Shinki, oh, that's what JYJ. Right? There are many, many Korean artists that are very popular now. And in fact, today, Oricon put up the music charts for the last week, it's the 10th through the 16th. And in the top 5 albums in Japan for this week, October 10th, October 16th, 2 were Korean groups. There was one other group in the top 5, and I think there was something like, I think it was 9 Korean groups in the top 100 albums sold last week. Now I checked, even as far back as 2005, when the Korean boom was just starting, and in the top 100, there were 2 Korean artists. So this is a really big expansion into pop music. Do we have any, I know Bill is a K-pop fan. Do we have any other K-pop fans? A couple of people. Okay, so we have a few fans. And it's definitely something that's really growing, right? If you go to any convenience store right now, you'll see posters for upcoming K-pop concerts. So the expansion of K-pop is a really big one. And of course, this is something that started with Winter Sonata, with one media source coming in and expanding and opening up the market for others. We also have more Korean dramas, right? There are whole cable channels that only show Korean dramas. Even if you don't have cable, if you watch regular TV, at almost any time of the day, you can probably find a Korean drama. And in fact, this is something that's been in the news a little bit recently. Has anyone heard about what's happening with Korean dramas on TV, with Fuji TV? Oh yeah. Before that, before 99 Days with the Star. Has anyone heard about what happened starting in August at Fuji TV? Demos, what kind of demos? Yeah, they were called anti-Hanryu demonstrations, right? Whole groups of people marched in front of the Fuji TV building to protest Korean dramas. They said, you're a Japanese network, but you only show Korean TV. We've had enough. We want more Japanese programming. So this all started, does anyone know how this started?
One famous actor's lady.
Yeah, it was a famous actor. Just put up a simple tweet saying, I wish Fuji TV would show more Japanese TV shows. Fairly simple, but it quickly became a movement that a lot of people said, yeah, why don't they show more Japanese TV shows? Yeah, we should protest. And it became a gathering, the first time of between 600 and 1,000 people gathered in front of Fuji TV on August 6th to protest the excessive use of Korean dramas. Now there were some people who were really just there because they're tired of Korean dramas, but there were also people who were there with more political agendas. There were people there talking about how the Takeshima or Dokdo should belong to Japan and not Korea, and trying to add other issues onto this debate. And that gave them kind of some bad press. But the first protest on August 6th was in the media, it was on TV in Japan as well as in Korea, and it got a lot of attention. So they had a much larger one on August 21st. On August 21st, you had much larger crowds marching. I think this picture is actually from the 21st. No more zombie wave. You had crowds gathering and marching and saying, you know, this is too much Hanryu, this is too much Korean media. We need to get back to Japanese shows. Now, as this is happening, Fuji TV is planning a new drama called 99 Days with a Star. It's about a Korean Hanryu star who comes to Japan and falls in love with her Japanese bodyguard. So it's a romantic story. It's a Japanese TV show, but it's about Hanryu. But suddenly, it's also being protested. Does anyone know why? Actually, just on Sunday, there was another protest at Fuji TV about this TV show. And it's because in 2005, the Korean actress, who will be a star of the show, was seen in Switzerland, giving out pamphlets saying that Takeshima or Dokdo should be a part of Korea and not a part of Japan. So the anti-Hanryu movement picked up on that and said, clearly this woman is anti-Japanese. She shouldn't be in a Japanese drama. She shouldn't be on TV. So it was a big protest against her. her response was, she's been to Japan more than 30 times. She loves coming to Japan. She's excited to be in the show. And like many other Hanryu stars, she said that she wanted to be a bridge between Japan and Korea. So you can take that either way. You can see her as someone who has a secret anti-Japanese message or a pro-Korea message and is trying to spread it in Japan. Or you can see her as someone who is trying to build a bridge between the two. I leave that to your judgment. The one other recent development that I'll talk about quickly is, I pointed out Yon-sama's still big. We can see Yon-sama at Family Mart right now. But he's not really the prince of Hanryu anymore. Right? There's a new prince of Hanryu. Does anyone know who that is? Anyone know? Chan Gun-suk, Gun-chan. Gun-chan, you have probably seen him on TV. You have probably seen him at the convenience store. You have probably seen him 1,000 places. He recently had a fan meet with over 60,000 fans. That's the largest Hanryu star fan meet ever, even larger than the crowds at Yon-sama. So he is extremely popular right now. He is the new big symbol of the Korean wave. He's kind of the up-and-coming star. Any Gun-chan? So I'll talk quickly about what's interesting to me about Gun-chan. So you have no Gun-chan fans. Why no Gun-chan fans? Because we have no old ladies here today. So Yon-sama was beloved because he was a perfect gentleman. And that's why he got the sama, right? Sama, king or prince, right? It's a sign of deep respect. But Gun-chan is chan, right? It's cute, it's affectionate. So does anyone know, what do people like about his character? He's a rebel. He's a punk, right? He is a brat. He gets on stage and he says, I'm the man you've all been waiting for. Right? He's got this kind of arrogant playfulness. And that is apparently what the women are looking for now. But what's interesting is, both in the case of Gun-chan and Yon-sama, there's not a lot of, sexy images. In both cases, you see more of kind of a family-style bond in what the fans are looking for from the character. With Yon-sama, they wanted kind of almost a brother/husband character, a man who could look after them and take care of them. And with Gun-chan, they want kind of like the naughty boy who's cute in a bad way. So I think these are interesting developments in where Hanryu is going today. So if I can sum up a little bit, kind of the main points that I wanted to get through here were that with the I don't want to say onslaught, but the advent, as Hanryu entered America, or entered Japan, as Hanryu entered Japan, it caused several changes, mostly through winter sonata. One of the biggest changes was the place that older women had in both the media and the economy. Suddenly, older women became a target audience for shows, a target consumer for goods, and they started spending huge amounts of money. So that was one big change. Another big change was all of these new images of Korea as a place you want to visit, a beautiful, young, modern, interesting place. And perhaps the most interesting point of that is that it started putting Korea as at or close to equal with Japan. There's always been a power relationship between Korea and Japan, where Japan was the stronger country, where Japan looked at Korea as though Korea was the past and Japan was the present. But now you have more images of a modern Korea that's at the level of Japan, or at least close. So this is a positive change. And of course, it has encouraged more and more Japanese people to take an interest in Korean language, in traveling to Korea, in meeting Korean people. So I think all of these things are positive changes. But on the whole, it has not really addressed the issues of the negative histories between Japan and Korea. It has not solved any of the big issues about Takeshima and Dokdo or about other territorial disputes. So it's creating better relationships between people, but not necessarily improving the overall relationship. And in fact, I would say that things like manga Hanryu are drawing more negative attention to the issues that are disputed between Japan and Korea. So on the one hand, you have more personal connections and more positive images. But on the other hand, you have more attention paid to the places where they disagree. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, we now can open for questions. But I would like to tell you that we will be offering Korean language courses next semester in the Open College. So there are some flyers at the back, so if you'd like to pick them up. There will be Korean language courses offered next semester in the Open College.
And not just for old ladies.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so
Oh,
questions
man.
for Mr. Gabrielson?